Great.
Hi. Welcome to the Ag Food Resiliency and Forestry Committee. And we've got Trey Martin here from Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. He's going to be joining us twice this week. I think now briefly for some testimony on H126, and then later in the week with some of your colleagues who are going to talk more generally about the work that you do.
Yes.
But we have this bill that we're trying to get some sense of, and have asked you to come in. So thank you for being here. Just because we haven't met before, you haven't met the committee, I think, this year. We'll go around quickly. And I'm David Durfee, represent Shaftesbury, Sunderland, and Glastonbury.
I'm Rodney Graham. I represent Orange 3, which is Chelsea and Williamstown.
Nice to see you.
Jed Lipsky, I represent Lamoille 1, Stowe.
Greetings.
Greetings.
Henry Pearl, I represent the towns of Danville, Peacham, and Cabot.
Nice to meet you.
Charles Wilson, Caledonia 3, which is Linden, Sheffield, Wheelock, Newark, and Sutton.
Nice to meet you.
Hey, how are you?
Nice.
Josie Levitt, Grand Isle, Chittenden, all of Grand Isle County, and West Milton.
A lot of area.
Yes, sir.
Mike Rice, Bennington, Rutland District, Danby, Dorset, Landgrove, Mount Tabor, and Peru.
Nice to
Got
meet
some
you.
house too.
Yeah. I used to teach at Burton
Oh,
before I went to law school. I know that area very well.
Hi, I'm Esme Cole, Windsor 6, Hartford.
Nice to meet you.
We have three of our committee members who are Zooming in remotely. If you want to go in order, Representative Supernaut.
Hi, apologies for being on Zoom. Heather Supernaut, Windsor 4, Barnard, Pomfret, and Bridgewater.
Greetings.
Representative O'Brien.
Hi there. I can't see anybody because the screen's full, but Representative John O'Brien, Windsor Orange 1, that's 2 towns, Royalton, and my hometown of Tunbridge.
Nice to see you.
And Representative Levitt. I'm sorry, Representative Templeman.
Hi. Hi, I'm David Templeman, representative of Barton, Brownington, and Westmore.
Hi there. Well, I'm Trey Martin. I'm the Director of Conservation and Rural Community Development at the Housing and Conservation Board. And I know some of you, and some of you I'm meeting for the first time. So just as a little bit more background, I arrived to VHCB last year. I started with the board last January. So this is my second full legislative session to be part of the team with Gus and Polly and other Liz Gleason you'll meet tomorrow as well. But before that, relevant to today's topics, I worked in the Shumlin administration and state government. I was the deputy secretary at the Agency of Natural Resources. I was Governor Shumlin's final secretary of administration. I'm an environmental lawyer. And most recently, I worked at Let's Grow Kids for a couple of years, helping them to build out their campaign for access to childcare. So I did that in between Shumlin administration and coming to VHCB, where I have returned to working on environmental and land conservation issues. Certainly, I grew up on a former farm that was subdivided in southern Ohio. I moved here in the early 1990s, back to New England, where my family had come from. So I understand the issues and questions really well and personally, both where we lived and where my dad had grown up, were farms that got cut up and sold off when the business model started to fail and when the large corporate farms took over a lot of those small family farms in the Ohio River Valley, much in similar ways to what we're talking about and seeing here. So I bring a lot of passion to that side of VHCB's work, as well as being an outdoor enthusiast and sportsman and biker, skier. I use the woods for just about all the things that, the public seeks to protect them for. You wanted to talk about H126, and I have a few slides that I think, they're not duplicative of the presentation we're going to give tomorrow, but I hope they provide some context for our work on the bill and the goals of the bill more broadly. This is a bill that is very similar to a bill that passed but was vetoed last year, H606, for those who were in the building last year. which VHCB worked with our partners to support the goals of that bill, just like we're working to support the goals of this bill. In fact, so much so that after 606 was vetoed last spring, we sat down with the Agency of Natural Resources, the Agency of Ag, and some of our land trust partners and said, would everybody like to continue this work? Whether or not a bill comes back to the legislature, whether or not a bill is passed and signed, is this work important to us to understand the current state of conservation in Vermont and to build a plan for the next 30 years so that we can prioritize our investments, so that we can use the state funding and federal funding that we have the most wisely towards the highest priorities, and so we can position Vermont, frankly, with a thoughtful plan and priorities to best draw down those resources. Conservation and land protection more broadly are a question of resources. Vermont has protected a lot of wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, recreation areas, waterways over the last 50 years. And the goals of this bill are very ambitious. We need to be seen as having a comprehensive vision and a comprehensive plan for biodiversity and habitat connectivity, but for the whole suite of conservation outcomes that we work on at VHCB: farmland conservation, town forest conservation, smart growth, housing for that matter, as well as those big natural area projects like that. You can see the Bird Mountain Wildlife Management Area behind me on the screen. Fabulous project when it was a relatively modest investment 10 years ago when VHCB worked with the feds and other partners to bring it down. 2,800 acres added at that time for an investment of $1.2 million, 600 of VHCB, 600 of federal dollars. But it added, it's one of the largest unbroken habitat blocks in Vermont down in the northern Taconic Mountains. And when you think about what we get with that sort of large scale conservation or habitat based conservation, we are, those big forest tracts host wildlife. They host diffuse recreational access hunting and fishing, as well as, other non-trail based access. They clean our air, they clean our water. Forest land like this is very important for the migration of species and the climate resilience that we talk about, not to mention carbon storage. So that's true at that scale. I hope you can see from that picture. The picture is supposed to be better than 1,000 words, and I've probably used like 800 already. So I'll move on. But that's an example of really large scale conservation activity. It's the kind of thing that this bill is looking to increase. What I'd ask you to consider today as we go through this is that we think about this as being additive, that the investments that H126 would call for over time would be additive to the conservation programs that we already do in this state, to farmland conservation, to town forest conservation, to recreation-based conservation, that those activities need to continue. And the conservation design tool that is talked about a lot in the context of this bill acknowledges that matrix forest that we seek to protect, those special natural communities, the riparian areas, those are all part of a working landscape. That they may not be the same as the working landscape in some cases, and in some cases they are, but that we're looking to protect the broad landscape with all those values and outcomes, including biodiversity, including connectivity, including habitat, but also including working farms, working forests, recreation areas, town forests, that kind of thing. So there's some backdrop. I'm just not going to advance the slide that way, do it there. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but the highlighted language here, this is from the enabling statute for VHCB. Just wanted to call that out, that we're talking about conserving and protecting agricultural land at VHCB in our work. Forest land, historic properties, natural areas, recreation lands, because those are vital to the economic well-being of the state and to the well-being of the people of Vermont. This is about the interconnection of the built landscape, where people are, the natural landscape, where species are. All of that needs to work together in harmony. And that's another Bennington County or Southern Vermont example there, the Equinox Highlands, huge project, 450,000 acres conserved since '87. This is one of the biggest chunks that VHCB has protected. And again, like Bird Mountain, getting a lot of those values from hunting and fishing to the ecosystem services. The, again, more to say about this tomorrow with Gus and Polly and Liz, but we have a allocation formula that's set in statute for our work. And my emails popping and aren't showing up, are they? Okay, good. Yeah, I get the little notices that somebody's emailed me and I don't want to distract y'all. So the allocation system is about balance. So first of all, when VHCB is funded through the general fund, through the property transfer tax transfer, half of the return by statute would go to VHCB. And then that's allocated, it's intended to be allocated evenly between the conservation mission and the housing mission. One-time funds and capital funds and federal funds also come through VHCB. But just thinking about that allocation system, it reflects our very, very broad mission. And even within the conservation mission, it's very broad. So the focus on farmland conservation is a part of what we do, working at the point of intergenerational transfer or when farms are struggling to inject funding into it, often in return for an option to purchase that land at agricultural value or the purchase of development rights on that farm. We're helping those farms to sustain themselves and have the working capital that they need. Similarly, with working forests and forest land, we're often working to conserve at the time when there's vulnerability to the conversion of that land to some other non-working landscape use. We also obviously are working with municipalities to protect town forests. We're working on doing a lot of very specific clean water work on farms and off farms, and we preserve historic properties throughout the state. All by way of background. So getting to what, our response last year that I alluded to earlier when H606 passed, but then was vetoed. And again, when we sat down with some of our closest partners, some of the land trusts and agencies who we work with most often, we fleshed out a conservation strategy initiative at that time, knowing that a bill might come back, knowing that a bill might pass or that it might not, it might get signed, it might not. We decided that this is so important that we want to move it forward. And we wanted to move it forward in a way that would either work with legislation or work if legislation doesn't move forward. And so, to get to the goals of H126, the idea that we would have really aggressive targets in this state and say that conservation and land protection are so important that we want to set that in statute is something that VHCB endorses and supports fully. There's a lot of confusion about the impact on working lands and working landscape. And so I know you might have some questions about that today. Wanted to lay out our position, which is, again, like I said earlier, that we have underfunded biodiversity protection and habitat protection at the landscape scale that's necessary to combat, climate change, to allow for the movement of species, to protect our air and water in ways that are important going forward over the next 30 to 50 years. We need to increase that. We are not advocating at VHCB to increase that by taking that out of the conservation mission and the other programs that we run. That this would, if this bill passes and is signed, we need to move forward in a way that's in harmony with those programs, with farmland conservation, with wildland conservation, farmland conservation, for example, just need to move together. And they do work together. Conservation design anticipates that they would work together, that species are going to move from waterways and sensitive areas like wetlands and rivers and ponds along riparian areas and other, natural areas up into those larger unbroken blocks of forest. And that's the job of conservationists and agencies to plot that out and to be very deliberate about how we build a connected landscape that's functioning and has those ecosystem values that we all think are so important. The goal of our initiative is the bolded language there in the bottom of the slide, to protect, maintain, and enhance a healthy, ecologically connected and functioning natural and working landscape. Every single one of those words was fought over and labored over to make sure that as the agencies and partners sat down together, that we agree what the goal is. And so those are all really, really key words. Protecting and maintaining, because we're doing a great job in Vermont. There's a crisis in this country. There's a crisis globally around biodiversity and the loss of natural areas. Vermont is doing better than most places. We have protected and we steward, and we have a history of protection and care for the land that is like almost nowhere else. And the landowners, the foresters, the loggers, the farmers, the conservationists and environmental groups who've done that work over the years we need to take a moment when we do this work to say thank you and to recognize that the state of things in Vermont right now is strong. We're losing forest land in some places. There's threats to farm viability and farmland security in the state, to be sure. And we need to focus on those. But we're starting from a place where what we're talking about is protect and maintain. And then to enhance by being very deliberate and strategic about how that landscape is connected and what tools are used to protect different areas. And when I say tools and protection, there's a lot more to conservation than just the state buying a big chunk of property. That Bird Mountain Wildlife Management Area is now, is transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Department in Vermont to be managed as a wildlife management area. That's one form that conservation and land protection can take. The sale of development rights to, through a conservation easement is another way that conservation works, and that this bill focuses on those two. But we also have current use. We have regulatory programs that protect land. We have stewardship initiatives that are voluntary. And all of those are what VHCB and its partners are thinking about when we talk about, the goals of H126 and the initiative, that sort of broader initiative that would be inclusive of those goals, but that really looks at the whole landscape. Not just the, kind of the matrix forest or the narrower goals of conservation design. Partners and stakeholders. I want to say a couple words about this and just make sure that as you all are thinking about the role we might play going forward, or that we intend to play going forward. And when I say intend to play, we've put an RFP out there. VHCB was well funded by this body last year. We got close to our full statutory formula. And so we had the money to dedicate to this. And we've published an RFP, and we're looking for proposals from consultants and experts who would help us to drive this initiative forward. We're not looking for new funding in the 24 budget, but we're going to use funding that we've already received to hire facilitators and experts who can help us through this process, which would include a lot of public outreach. And so the initial partners, the folks that we sat down with, who we do business with a lot, you can see there on the top of the slide, the land trusts and the agencies. But the folks that we need to hear from if we're building a conservation plan for Vermont are not just those land managers and land trusts, but the private landowners, the foresters, the farmers, the folks who work that land, working lands, businesses. We want to hear from the conservation community, the environmental community, to be sure. We want to hear from folks who are interested in land access and equity of access to land in Vermont. A really important topic. We want to hear from outdoor rec organizations, municipalities, conservation commissions. We intend to have a process that's broadly inclusive and robust and outreach over several phases, and the development of the plan, the review of a plan, and then the creation of a conservation plan. And so we follow the path of the bill, and the bill follows the path that we've laid out with our partners, which is to do two phases of work. The first phase is a catalog. We need to understand what we're currently protecting, how we're protecting it, how that's been funded, and the form that those protections take. So how much land does the state own currently? What's the public land profile of protected land? What does the private, conserved land look like? How many current use acres do we have in forestry? How many do we have in agriculture? What does the wetlands program at ANR do? What does the shoreland protection program at ANR do? What does, other regulatory programs like that? What kinds of incentive programs are protecting land? How does outdoor recreation and the existence of agreements like the VAST trails or the, Kingdom trails that have landowner agreements that allow people to use those to recreate on, how does that help to protect land? Some of those are really enduring and permanent legal protections. When the state acquires land and it's subject to a conservation easement, that's permanent. That's land that's protected forever, unless the rule of law fails. Current use is a very strong tax-based incentive. You all know about this. I'm sure I don't mean to lecture you on it, but it's also it's only as good as the landowners, as a landowner not taking on that lien, right? If you pay off the lien, you can develop the acres that are in current use. Most don't, because I think it goes back to that history of stewardship and that history of protection and investment that we have in our land here in Vermont. But it's not an enduring permanent legal protection. And regulatory programs are regulatory in that they allow activities based on a permit. So you can get a permit associated with development in or near a wetland. It's hard. I don't want to advertise that. It's not something that we want to do a lot of, but there's a program that allows that consideration. Same with development within 250 feet of a lake or a pond bigger than 10 acres. We have a law that says that's very limited, but it allows some kind of small scale clearing and creation of impervious surface. So checks and balances in the regulatory programs. At any rate, that's our aim at the beginning of this, and consistent with H126 is let's build out that catalog so we know what we've currently done and where the holes are. How's that data gathered? How can it be, how can we use that to educate folks? When we have that work, the next phase would then be to sit down, to educate the public around what we've done so far and where the gaps are, where the needs are, what's missing in the conservation design vision, what's missing in the, forest action plan or forest future roadmap vision for Vermont, what's missing in the Nature Conservancy's connected and resilient landscape model for Vermont. Where are we missing opportunities to create ecosystem services and the values that they have? So we'll run that plan through that analysis and then hear from people about what the values and goals are for the public. How do we move forward? What are the priorities? Is it the connective pieces? Is it those special natural communities? Is it a series of 5, 10, 12, 15 really large scale projects like Bird Mountain or Equinox Islands or the Champion Lands, places that we've protected over the years? Are those the kinds of projects that we want to see go forward? Is it municipal forests? Is it riparian areas and buffers? There's so many choices and not enough resources to do all of it. So prioritizing needs to take account of the wishes of the public. We'd bring that plan, we would develop a plan based on that outreach and education, and then we would bring it back out to the public. The bill, I think, calls for a series of at least 12 public meetings that VHCB would facilitate. And not only will we facilitate it for land trusts and people who are already doing this, but make sure that there's equitable access to this process. In the development of the Climate Action Plan, there were many who felt frustrated about not being able to participate because the amount of commitment and time commitment was easy for people who were well off or able to, structure their jobs so that they could participate. But people who have to work day in and day out, people who come from communities that traditionally aren't asked or who don't get to participate, felt like their voices weren't heard. So we have asked for a little bit of an extra appropriation going forward to support that kind of equity of access, to make sure that we're hosting events that have, that where people who need a travel voucher or who need childcare or who, if they're asked to serve on a committee, would be able to be compensated for their time. So a real strong commitment to outreach as we go through the development of that plan. I've kind of touched on these already, but just to say again that the conservation design is a really important and fabulous tool that the agency developed in order to create a framework for understanding conservation priorities. It's one of many plans and tools that we've developed that we would want to consult as we do this work. So the Climate Action Plan is another. It has multiple recommendation areas and sub goals around climate resilience and habitat protection that we need to take into account. A&R has some important tools that they've developed, the forest and wildlife action plans and the forest future roadmap that's being developed right now. And Commissioner Fitzko is doing a fabulous job with that. I went to one of the hearings last week, and it's so impressive the way that they're thinking about the connection between the land and the enterprises. And then I mentioned TNC and Trust for Public Land. And then we've done a lot of work in Vermont to say, how are we going to protect our waters from impacts that are stressing them? So that's a very quick tour through. By the way, this is up in the Northeast Kingdom. I think that's with Willoughby Peaks with Westmore. So for folks up that way, a project that took about 20 years to bring to fruition. It was initially came up for sale, I think, back in the Kuhn administration, and Vermont wasn't able to acquire it, and it was held privately. And then more recently, it was protected with the great work from the Nature Conservancy and some funding from VHCB and others. And I think that's a picture that Heather Furman, who's the director of TNC, took, which is one of my favorite photos of again, back to that large scale landscape protection that's at the heart of H126. So that's all context. I tried to weave in there some important points, which is that H126 sets really critical and important goals for the state around conservation. It sets numeric targets. It prescribes process. It identifies stakeholders. It tasks the agency of natural resources and VHCB with working together to develop and bring this plan forward. It is something that you'll hear from us that VHCB supports and endorses, and something that we can continue to refine and think about how does it accommodate the larger conservation mission that we have in Vermont, which is inclusive not just of targeting not just matrix forest and interior forest, but also farmland and working forest and community forest and recreation areas. All of it would, in our vision, would need to work together. And we think that that's true to conservation design. We think it's true to the state's goals around our historic settlement patterns, that we want to have strong, vibrant communities, village centers, town centers that are surrounded by those working farms and forests as a place to recreate, and then leading up to those less used or less managed places in Vermont. So I'll stop there and see what questions you might have.
Thank you, Trey, for that introduction and explanation. We don't have the bill officially in our committee, but it was brought to our attention because of a couple of concerns, an initial concern and then a second one that sort of came more to light today. One from the forestry community, one from the agriculture community, but just together, I guess, concerns that the bill would have an impact on availability of working lands, I guess, to summarize it, so that in the one case, land that's conserved under either by 2030 or by 2050 would potentially not be available for working. And I'd be interested in hearing your response to that. In the agricultural case, our understanding, and we had a question about this earlier, was that the conservation as defined in this bill doesn't include ag land that's been conserved. But there's still a question about whether, in theory anyway, land that is currently in agricultural production might be identified as land that should be conserved for the purposes of this bill. So two different questions. If you need me to restate them, I can.
Well, why don't I go in reverse order, and since I remember the second question most clearly, and you maybe remind me about the first one.
Yeah.
In terms of agricultural land and the availability of agricultural land, the definition, I think it's possible to read and parse the language and say this is somehow inclusive of agricultural land, but I don't think that's the most common reading of the definition in the bill. And I do think that that's something that we would support working on. It's certainly not in VHCB's mission to stop protecting and conserving agricultural lands, nor is it VHCB's vision that there aren't opportunities for connection and landscape resilience connectivity on our ag lands. The ag lands not only host a lot of forest land, a lot of farms have woodlots and sugar bushes and other forest lands on them that are part of that tapestry that I was describing of moving from the village center out to the sort of interior forest. That's the place where we connect, is through the working lands along the streams and rivers that run through ag lands, as well as through the working forests that are on ag lands. So I don't know that the bill includes that right now. I think we should get some clarity on that. VHCB isn't hung up on the numeric goals as much as on the high functioning and connected landscape is the goal, the qualitative goal as opposed to the quantitative goal. And nor would we advocate to redirect funding out of the farmland programs that we have. We need to use the money that's allocated to farmland conservation each year. We draw down a lot of federal funding through NRCS to do that work. And if we'd be leaving money on the table if we took from that. But moreover, I think it's consistent with the vision that we have for this landscape, both VHCB, our state statutes, the preamble to Vermont Conservation Design talks about working farms and forests and natural communities all being part of one tapestry. So taking it out of production, conservation is an action between two willing partners. Any landowner who doesn't want to conserve their land doesn't need to work with a conservation entity to do so. Any landowner who's continuing to successfully work their land is, they may see that the sale of development rights to help fund their operation is a good thing. But it's certainly not compulsory, and I don't think this bill makes it compulsory.
So thank you for that. And I'll turn to the committee in a minute to see if you have follow-up questions or other questions. But the first part of my question then was back to the forestry side and whether requiring, and that's the wrong word because there are no requirements, but setting a goal for 50% of land to be conserved under these definitions would restrict the use of timberland that's currently being used today.
It's not I would not say I would say it's not the most, it's not how we structure conservation easements to restrict the use of those lands for production of wood products or forest products. So a lot of conservation easements include an allowance for logging and harvest to create forest products. There are places that either in farmland conservation or in forest land conservation sometimes that are protected and that are protected outside of management. But of the 450,000 acres, the number that was on the slide that VHCB is protected, I think that it's a small percentage of that would be unmanaged. And this is one of the areas where the bill, I think at one point there was a target in there around those categories 1 and 2 that are less managed, about around 10%. Maybe that was in last year's bill. But it's not in the bill right now. So I don't think there's a mandate in the bill that categories 1 and 2 would be this amount of percentage of the 30 or the 50 or that amount or somewhere in between. I think the bill is somewhat deferential to the process. There's some language that invites the process to come back and to add definition, to add clarity to those 3 categories, to make recommendations back to this body about how those 3 categories might be improved. And one way that we might think about this is after we do the baseline, after we do the catalog, is to say, how are we doing on interior forest block protection? How are we doing on connectivity? How are we doing on farmland protection? How are we doing on working forest protection? Here's when we read all those things together, going forward, what our process should look like and what our priorities should look like. So it's hard for me to answer where we are now without going through that process. And I don't see the bill as prescribing, only this kind of conservation or only that kind of conservation. Category 3 is inclusive of sustainable forest or sustainable harvest and sustainable forestry. I think that's a big chunk of what VHCB has already protected and a large chunk of what we'd be doing going forward. And it can still be really consistent with the goals of connectivity, functioning landscape, habitat blocks, biodiversity, that, our foresters and loggers and farmers in Vermont are really conscious of using practices that support bird habitat, that support aquatic habitat, that support, species passage and that sort of thing. It's part of the fabric and culture and history of the way that we steward land in Vermont.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, Trey, thank you. Jed Lipsky, Stowe. And before I get to some specific points, I want to let you know that I have a active conservation history in Vermont since 1968 when I worked for the Conservation Society of Southern Vermont, long before the Vermont Land Trust, up through working with Heather Furman and Kristen Sharpless as a director of the Stowe Land Trust for a 9-year period. But so I'm not antagonistic, certainly, to phase 1, but there are a few things came up in Brownsville, which you highlight, very active, and that was the town taxpayers. VHCB, Vermont Land Trust, great partnerships. But one thing that I have had serious concern and need to disclose, I've been an active logging contractor for over 56 years and still am. And in my community, that is the logging, forest products industry, forester community, felt that the engagement of that particular community was quite absent, to put it politely. Not this committee, but I personally led an effort to try to get some possession of that bill, not just a drive-by that lasted a half hour. But under your Vermont Conservation Strategic Initiative, partners and stakeholders, you used a term that's not written here. And this is what my comment's going to focus on, about talking the talk and walking the walk. I've been involved with conservation of thousands of acres. And people like to talk about the working lands or the working forests. But the working forest community was left out of most of the conversation, bringing H126, to the table. And you talked under public stakeholders, 2003, 2004, under the public and private land managers, land trusts, and funders. You spoke words, including loggers, landowners, and foresters, but they're not written there. And I have watched great enthusiasm to conserve working lands. But once that's done, for instance, we held Brownsville Forest for about 24 hours, and then it was turned over to Forest Parks and Recreation. They have pretty much withdrawn the last several years from only a very tiny bit to zero management. So I bring to my question to you, and I am a deep partner in land conservation and forest land conservation, that working portion feels somewhat left out and very concerned about the viability of forest products industry as well as working lands workforce, which include loggers and forests. So I have very serious concerns about. It's exciting to talk about it, and it'll be engaged, and particularly critical because under the high level of regulation and requirement to preserve productive and forest soils and sustainable forest soils and wildlife and recreation and bird habitat and clean water and all these other very high priorities, we've added carbon sequestration and carbon storage as a high value. And I think that more discussion from forestry professionals would be very appropriate, particularly on the level of management. No one's talking about intruding on wetlands, riparian areas, vernal pools, sensitive areas, or unique forest structures, or trying to replicate old growth characteristics. But the vast amount of work in forests, my concerns basically feel that community is not encouraged or comfortable. End of that long comment.
I'd love to respond if there's a question in the comment, and if there's just a comment in the comment, I'm happy to receive it and for the very thoughtful words that you spoke.
I think we like to treat all of our communication as questions.
Okay.
So if you do have a response, we'd like to hear it.
Well, my initial response is just thank you for saying that eloquently and with passion and personal feeling. I really appreciate that. I'm glad that you articulated that. I'm here today to signal VHCB's intent around this process and some of our partners. I can't speak to how the process has worked in other committees or in the building last year, whether, how inclusivity happened in rooms that I'm not.
I wasn't here last year.
Yeah, and, but I was trying to signal to you, to the committee, and to anybody who might be listening that we're very mindful of the people who work the land and in being inclusive in our process. And when these are a little bit shorthand from the document that we've published calling for proposals to help us. But when I look at this, I do see those, the land managers and land trusts, but then it's the landowners. It's the forest, farm, and recreation landowners. And then it's the rural businesses, the rural enterprises, the lot, which to me is inclusive of those who have agriculture-based businesses, forestry-based businesses, food and wood processing businesses, the kinds of folks who have the history of taking care of this land and creating a living from that. Those are the people who would be part of our process as we begin the next phase of this, which is sitting down with a facilitator and a consultant and saying, how do we move forward? It'd be reaching out to people like Sam Lincoln, who I know you're going to hear from and who I know well from his time at FPR, who I've been talking to about this process and saying.
He did come.
Yeah. Okay, you already heard from
colleague. Yeah.
And I managed a working forest and developed a forest management plan. I know how hard it is and how much work it takes to do that work, as well as having grown up in and around farms that were transitioning to non-farms. So I have personally deep respect for and esteem for the people who do that work and how hard that work is. And I can say on behalf of VHCB and our partners that's what I want you to hear is that those are the people we want to hear from. That's the process that we want to conduct. And I think that the way that H126 is articulated allows us to do the process that we want. And if a narrower set of answers is what the legislature wants to hear back from our broader process, that's fine. But we want to think about conservation broadly to be inclusive of the kinds of things that you spoke about, as well as those, interior forest blocks and connectivity points, the vernal pools, which one of my favorite places in the woods. The deep slopes where the yellow birch and hemlock are creating that shade and special habitat. Those two. You might not be cutting there, you might not have a harvest plan there, but those are part of the fabric of that working landscape.
Thank you.
Call on Representative Templeman, but just to be clear for the committee, if you don't have the bill in front of you or haven't committed it to memory, the VHCB is integral in developing the plan. We'll work with the VHCB to engage stakeholders as part of so this is reassuring to hear. Representative Templeman.
Hi.
If I say one thing.
Dave, just a second. Sorry, I cut off the witness. So go ahead, Trey.
One thing I want to be clear about on behalf of our partners is that VHCB is a convener and a funder often in the work that we do. And so I will not be writing this plan. I have a certain level of understanding and facility. My colleagues at VHCB do, but we would be engaging the broader community and experts within the community on these topics, not just, as we were talking about the landowners and rural businesses, but also, conservationists and folks who do this work day in and day out. So we'll be seeking to pull together a plan that's not reflective only of VHCB's work and values, but of the broader community's values. Just wanted to.
Good. Yeah. No, thank you for clarifying that. Now, Representative Templeman, thank you for being patient.
Sorry about that earlier. Conservancy is a very complicated matter. It can mean a lot of different things, and we've seen it co-opted. We've seen it mean zero management practices. We've seen a lot of incarnations of conservancy. You know, even Act 250 is, you know, a conservancy measure, and in part to conserve farmland. And one may argue that farmland isn't necessarily an ecological endeavor, right? So, but I'm of the impression that this is a ecological centric bill, that the Conservancy is specific to that. I mean, we've talked about the protection of biodiversity. Primarily, that's what I'm picking up on, actually. So, however, Conservancy in this particular a 30 by 30 plan is very complicated because it takes into account a lot of different factors, including the working lands element. So what actually Conservancy is in this, I'm a little confused by. But I've kind of narrowed it down in my own way of organizing this in my head into two categories. One would be practices, and the other one would be lack of practices or no management. So in terms of practices, I'm envisioning, tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, these are all assumptions and I want to be corrected. But the practices would include restrictions, right? So there's a place in here for agriculture and agroforestry, but I would imagine that some of the practices would need to be more sensitive to achieve the ecological end. And then from a previous testimony, I understand that 10% of the 30% wouldn't be touched at all, may not have any management practices whatsoever, or management in terms of hands-on. Can you speak to my assumptions and tell me if I'm off base here?
Thank you. I think that first to agree with you that, I think, former Commissioner Mike Snyder did a great job of explaining conservation as like little c conservation and big C conservation. There's the act of legally protecting a piece of land, acquiring it for the state or buying the development rights. Then there's the set of practices and stewardship and activities that happen, that little c conservation that we talk about. And so that's why I really want to emphasize a suite or a set of tools and strategies that includes those permanent enduring legal protections, as well as the kinds of things, programs like current use or regulatory programs or voluntary stewardship. In terms of the goals of the bill and the way that it's articulated, I do think that there was, I keep turning around as if you're right there, but maybe that's not actually effective. Yeah, I'll look at the camera. Representative Tillman, thank you. I think the bill, at some point in the process, there was a goal around places where management and timber extraction or logging or intervention would be restricted. I think it was there was a 10% number in there at some point. I don't think is in the bill that came through this committee. So I think it's up to the process to determine how to best implement the goals of conservation design and those other tools that would protect places. Some places would have very light or no management under the goals of this bill. Some places would have, light management to, some more intrusive management. And then some places would be, managed, with more economic goals in mind, but still have conservation aspects to them. This bill would, or at least our goals around this bill would be also to identify how we protect farmland through that. So I guess I would say I agree with you, or I can stop turning around. I agree with you. I think there's some understanding better how that process how's that plan going to come back? What's it going to say? How much of the landscape should be not managed or restricted? I think that right now the bill doesn't set that out there. And I think in the individual acts of conservation, we don't look at a whole parcel and say this whole parcel is going to be treated the same, but we often look at whether it's a piece of farmland or a working forest, and the different parts of it might have different activities on them. That's probably the approach that that we're going to prescribe as we go forward, is to think about the functions and values of any part of the landscape. How is connectivity how's biodiversity being protected? And then what level of activity makes sense there? If it's like, truly interior forest at the top of a peak or, high elevation, or steep slopes, it's going to have a lot less activity. Current use added a category last year that allows landowners to do that. And that's I think is a nice way of, a nice, analogy to the kinds of outcomes that we would be thinking about. And certainly there are places that should have less human activity if we're thinking about connectivity and if we're thinking about interior forest health. But I don't think that that's 50% of the landscape. I think when we talk about the 50% goal, we're talking about a blend of that and then a lot of working landscape that goes with that. Or at least that's the vision that we've talked about within our work. And it's what we've done to date. I think there are very few places VHCB has conserved and said, thou shalt not enter. Going back to that first slide I showed you, this is about the economic vitality and the well-being of the people of the state, our work, which means having economic activity, having human activity, having entry onto land for, different kinds of recreational or economic activities.
I see Representative O'Brien has a virtual hand up. If you want to glance at him, and then he'll ask his question.
Hi, Trey. I had a question earlier when we were talking about this, Bill, but you probably know a lot more about the potential answer. And it was, is there does a parcel have to be a certain size to be conserved?
Not necessarily. The act of conservation is complicated and there are closing costs and costs associated with appraisal and, a lot of work goes into it. So, it doesn't make sense on certain parcels, Representative O'Brien, if they were, really small. My dad was just asking me about he loves to look at the land for sale here in Vermont, and he looked at a 5-acre parcel. He said, that'd be a great conservation parcel, right? I said, yeah, probably not, Dad. That's right around the corner from a place where we just protected 2,200 acres. That's a pretty large acquisition for conservation, but 5 acres is probably too small. Our working forest guidelines that we use to do conservation of privately held lands that are, have a working forest, a set of working forest goals associated with them. So whether, sugar bushes or logging operations, we don't like to go much below 50 acres, but we could. Current use forestry is 25 acres enrolled, at least contiguous. So those are probably the numbers where it starts to become not viable or not, it doesn't make economic sense below those. And then you have to steward that land after it's protected or acquired. And that means investing it at least in being on that land. The national standards for land trusts are that every 5 years you have to get on that land, make sure that there's no encroachments, make sure that you're tracking invasive species, make sure that there's no illegal trail cutting or activities that are outside the management plan. Most Vermont organizations get on a lot more often than that. That's really intensive. Like that's a very resource intensive effort. And so when we talk about these long-term conservation goals, it's not just thinking, Representative O'Brien, about the size of parcels we may acquire, but then how are they going to be managed and stewarded in the long haul? And that's that kind of capital S stewardship that's consistent with Land Trust Alliance standards. And then there's like enhancement and are there places that you're going to reforest or plant differently or riparian areas that are going to get special treatment? So the kind of lowercase s stewardship that might happen on the land. And so parcels below a certain size, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I don't think there's any law or any regulation or anything in VHCB's rules that would say something is too small or something's, just the right size. But I would probably track it around the way that we think of current use. 25 and up is probably what we're talking about. And if you can have land that's contiguous, it makes more sense. So, sometimes we'll protect a smaller parcel, but then it connects to a much larger. So the Bird Mountain acquisition that I featured was a small acquisition that added acreage to a much larger management area. Equinox Highlands was a similar thing, adding it on to, to the Green Mountain federal lands, or connecting it to that.
So what I was thinking about is, have you seen an inventory, Vermont's 5.4 million acres. Have you seen an inventory of what acreage in Vermont is sort of not possible to conserve, from Rutland City to, suburban lots, and going forward, we've got a lot of parcels being divided into smaller and smaller pieces. We've got forest fragmentation. So, when we say 30 by 30, a certain amount of that could never be conserved. So it almost seems like, has there been talk of conserving 30% of what's possible to conserve in Vermont, and taking the rest that could never be conserved out of that equation?
That's a good question. I don't think anybody has articulated the question quite that way. I often hear the reverse, the question that came up earlier, which is, are there places that would have to stop having their other uses in order to have this kind of protection? And I don't like that way of thinking about it, really. But, to choose your example, so Rutland City, probably not a great place for like a heavy investment on biodiversity-based conservation, but that's not to say that there wouldn't be, Pine Hill Park in Rutland City is a fabulous resource. It's protected. I don't know whether it's conserved or whether it's protected and owned by the city, but it's a way that a community has a set of conservation goals. The streams in Rutland City could be protected differently and legally beyond just regulations. We could, especially streams that connect the city to the lake or connect the city to the highlands, up in Killington and Okemo and everything. So I wouldn't rule out that there would be the possibility of making investments that go down through the working landscape and through the settled areas that would have conservation value or connectivity value. It won't be a 2,500 acre project. It would be smaller. It might be a linear project, like a riparian area conservation. It might be a town forest that connects to working lands around it. The park right behind us is a good example of a protected place in a otherwise relatively settled area. East Montpelier and Montpelier have a lot of agriculture land, or East Montpelier has a lot of ag lands, and Montpelier has a lot of subdivision and housing. But there's a lot of value, conservation value, and connectivity value through these woods behind you here.
The inventory would look into those areas in Rutland, parks and the
What's protected? How is it protected? How enduring are those protections? Do we have gaps? Do we have data gaps or actual gaps in what's protected? How does it stack up against the vision of these different plans and tools? That's what we'd be doing in phase one.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and encouraged by what you had to say. We may reach out again if we have any questions, but
I'll swing by tomorrow. How about that?
See you then,
You bring the donuts, 7 o'clock.
with a different PowerPoint, we know. Representative Sims has been very patiently waiting for her turn, so I think we should stop and stretch, and then come